Balochi-Platform YouTube channel.
Okay, so, you guys sent in some really, really interesting stuff, and it all seems to revolve around this idea of, the responsibility of intellectuals, which feels, I think, more relevant now than ever.
Definitely, yeah.
So we're going to kind of tackle that head on.
Okay.
And really try to dig into some of the core ideas and any suggestions that come through in this book that you shared with us.
Okay.
And it's called The Responsibility of Intellectuals, Reflections by Noam Chomsky and Others. After 50 years, it's edited by Allot, Knight, and Smith.
Okay.
And it's kind of this collection of essays that, reflect on Chomsky's original essay,
Right.
along with discussions from a conference marking the 50th anniversary.
Okay. All right.
So our goal in this deep dive is to kind of be your guides through this material.
Gotcha.
Help you extract, the most important, the most crucial insights quickly but thoroughly.
Right.
And maybe even spark a few aha moments for you guys.
I love that.
So, with that said, let's just jump right in.
All right, let's do it.
To the first big question.
Yeah, so looking at all these reflections that we have here, the natural starting point, I think, has to be, understanding the original context.
Yeah.
And the central argument of Chomsky's 1967 essay.
Okay.
So, what was the core of it all?
Okay, so let's unpack that original essay a little bit.
Yeah.
So this landed in 1967. Right smack dab in the middle of the Vietnam War.
Right in the thick of it.
Yeah. So to really grasp its impact, I think you have to kind of picture the environment at the time.
Yeah, the context.
And as this book highlights, the fact that Chomsky delivered this at Harvard is key.
Oh, interesting.
So you have to think about, the intellectual elite of the time and their close ties to the government.
For sure.
You had prominent Harvard figures deeply involved in the Kennedy and Johnson administration.
Right.
George Bundy, for instance, who was practically a kingpin in national security.
Had been the dean of arts and sciences at Harvard.
Oh, wow.
So there was this real intertwining of academia and power.
Yeah, definitely. And it's a crucial point, too, because it wasn't just about these high-level connections.
Right.
But the book really paints a picture of the broader social climate at the time.
Yeah.
So in October 1965, just a couple of years before Chomsky's essay, there were these major anti-war protests in Boston.
Wow.
Right in Harvard's backyard.
Yeah.
And they were met with significant violence from counter-demonstrators.
Really?
And even the Boston Globe,
Right.
a paper you'd expect to be, a little more liberal.
Yeah.
Strongly condemned the anti-war movement.
Wow.
So you had this intense pressure to conform to this pro-war stance, even in intellectual centers like Harvard.
Right. So against this backdrop of war and this seemingly compliant intellectual class, Chomsky steps in with this really direct challenge.
Yeah.
And his central argument was that intellectuals,
by virtue of their education, their access to information, their platform, have a profound responsibility to speak truth to power. And it wasn't enough to just have private doubts about the war or government policy.
Right.
They had a duty to actively expose lies and challenge the prevailing narratives, especially when the government was acting unjustly.
Right.
So this is the core insight here, I think.
Yeah.
Is that intellectual privilege comes with this moral obligation to hold power accountable.
Totally. And that leads us to this next critical area that this book really explores.
Okay.
Which is, how has this responsibility evolved over the past 50 years? I mean, the world in 2024 looks a lot different than it did in 1967.
Yeah.
So what are some of the key shifts?
Yeah.
And how have they impacted this core idea?
Oh, this is where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
One of the most significant shifts that a lot of the contributors point out is this immense increase in corporate control over mainstream media. And this makes it much tougher for intellectuals with dissenting viewpoints to get their voices heard on a large scale.
Right.
But at the same time, and this is kind of the duality here, we've seen this explosion of the internet and social media, which offers this incredible potential for alternative platforms, for voices that might otherwise be marginalized to find an audience.
Totally.
And social media can be, a real game changer for rapidly raising awareness and organizing, even under oppressive regimes.
Definitely. And you know what's fascinating about that is while these new technologies offer these incredible opportunities for disseminating information and challenging established narratives, they also come with their own set of challenges.
Right.
So the book touches on this very real phenomenon of social media bubbles, where individuals primarily encounter information and perspectives that reinforce their existing beliefs, often shaped of those very mainstream narratives that they might think they're escaping. And the rapid-fire, often context-free nature of a lot of online platforms can make it really difficult to engage in the kind of nuanced, in-depth analysis that Chomsky's original call to responsibility implied.
Right. And speaking of challenging, deeply held beliefs, the book kind of delves into this really counterintuitive concept, the backfire effect. And the idea is that when people are presented with facts that contradict their political beliefs, instead of changing their minds, they can actually become more entrenched in those beliefs.
That's interesting.
It's like our brains have this built-in defense mechanism against information that threatens our worldview.
That's so wild.
Oh.
Makes sense, though, in a way.
Yeah.
Right? Like you don't want to just change your mind.
Totally. And it really highlights, how important it is strategically for intellectuals to think about how they frame and deliver their arguments. But, it's important not to fall into complete pessimism here. The book presents some counter-evidence suggesting that information can indeed lead to changes in opinion.
Good.
So, for example, there are these studies examining attitudes towards immigration in diverse countries, including Japan. And these demonstrated that providing people with accurate information actually improved their attitudes towards immigration. And even in some instances led individuals with more conservative leanings to support more open immigration policies.
Oh, wow. So it can work.
Yeah, so it shows us that, while the backfire effect is definitely a factor, it's not an absolute barrier to changing minds.
That's good to know.
Yeah, and the reflections also address some other kind of worrying trends that might hinder intellectuals from speaking out today.
Like what?
So there's a concern raised about a narrowing of what's considered acceptable political thought.
Oh, interesting.
And a potential decline in academic freedom. And Craig Murray's contribution provides this really powerful historical comparison. He reminds us that in 1879, Gladstone, who's this towering figure in British politics, publicly defended the right of Afghans to resist British troops. Because Britain had invaded their country. And it's hard to imagine a similarly prominent figure in the UK or the US today stating that someone fighting our troops might be justified without facing this massive and likely hostile media reaction.
Yeah, totally. It's like that Overton window.
Exactly.
The spectrum of acceptable discourse has narrowed significantly in certain areas.
It seems so.
Yeah. And the book also brings up this idea of value-oriented intellectuals being viewed with suspicion by some powerful groups.
Interesting.
Yeah, and it references the Trilateral Commission's crisis of democracy, which expressed concern about intellectuals who dedicated themselves to questioning authority and established institutions, particularly their influence on younger generations in schools and universities.
Interesting.
So this highlights this, this recurring tension between those who uphold existing power structures and those who see an intellectual responsibility to critique them.
Yeah, absolutely. So considering this, evolving and sometimes challenging landscape, what specific areas or issues does the book highlight as particularly demanding intellectual scrutiny and action?
What should people be focusing on today?
Yeah, where should intellectuals be focusing their attention?
Well, unsurprisingly, the persistent threats of war and nuclear weapons remain a central focus. Milan Rai's analysis of British nuclear policy is particularly insightful, I thought. He applies the Chomsky-Herman propaganda model, which briefly outlines how media filters information to serve dominant interests, to the way nuclear weapons are discussed in the media. And he argues that this often reinforces the state's perspective and limits the scope of public debate. And he points out that nuclear deterrence in practice has involved cultivating a wholesome respect for the destructive power of nuclear states among those perceived as potential challengers to their dominance.
It's the sobering reminder that these weapons aren't just abstract deterrents.
Right.
Their possession and threatened use have real-world implications for international relations and the potential for catastrophic conflict.
Yeah, and the book also underscores this crucial responsibility of scientists.
Yeah.
Especially when facing existential threats like climate change.
Right.
The conference Q&A features this great discussion with Chomsky on this very topic, referencing the historical formation of groups like the Union of Concerned Scientists,
Right.
which emerged from protests at MIT.
Wow.
Driven by concerns about the military applications of scientific research. And Chomsky is just unequivocal in his condemnation of the Republican Party's stance on climate science.
Right.
Labeling it as incredibly dangerous.
Wow, so he doesn't hold back at all.
Nope.
Okay, and the scope of intellectual responsibility kind of extends to confronting historical injustices and challenging dominant narratives about the past.
Yeah.
So the colonization of the Americas and the history of slavery are highlighted as critical areas where ongoing intellectual scrutiny is essential to counter often sanitized or incomplete accounts that have shaped our understanding of the present.
Totally. And the book notes how for a long time, even within academia, the indigenous population of the Americas before European arrival was significantly underestimated.
Really?
A figure that has been dramatically revised.
Wow.
As these dominant narratives have been challenged.
That's fascinating.
Yeah. And the discussion around the Israeli-Palestinian conflict also raises these complex ethical and intellectual challenges.
Right.
So the book explores the BDS movement, boycott divestment sanctions, presenting Chomsky's nuanced perspective.
Okay.
He draws a distinction between tactics specifically targeting settlements in occupied territories, which he sees as potentially effective in pressuring for change, and broader boycotts of Israel itself, which he views as more problematic and potentially counterproductive for the Palestinian cause. So his emphasis is always on considering the likely consequences of any action for the victims of the conflict.
Right. Which leads us to this particularly revealing section of the book, which examines Noam Chomsky's own long and complex relationship with MIT, an institution deeply involved in military research.
Yeah.
So what insights does this offer into the practical challenges and dilemmas faced by intellectuals working within systems that may be implicated in activities they oppose?
That's such a good question. And the contrasting views on maintaining or severing ties with military research within MIT offer this crucial insight. That the responsibility of intellectuals can manifest in these diverse strategies. From engaging from within to advocating for complete separation. Each with its own potential benefits and drawbacks.
Yeah, this is a fascinating case study in navigating these complexities.
For sure.
So we learn about Chomsky's early role as a consultant for Mitery Corporation, which was actively developing technology used in the Vietnam War. And there's this palpable sense of his personal unease, even extending to concerns about his wife Carol's work on an air defense project.
Oh, wow.
At MIT's Lincoln Laboratory.
Really?
And he worried about the potential military applications of their research.
Yeah.
Even if it appeared to be focused on more abstract areas like natural language processing.
Interesting.
And what's particularly striking is his later perspective on student protests against military-related work at MIT in the late 1960s. And he made this argument that often the most ethically questionable work wasn't happening within the university's core academic departments, but rather in these separate entities like MITR, which raises these really important questions about, where an intellectual's responsibility lies when they are affiliated with this larger institution that has connections to potentially harmful activities.
Totally. And the book brings to light this really surprising debate that occurred at MIT regarding its military labs. So there was actually a left-wing position supported by Chomsky that argued for maintaining a formal connection between MIT and these labs. And the logic was that this connection would provide a continuous opportunity for scrutiny, education, and activism aimed at ultimately ending their involvement in military research.
Oh, wow.
So ironically, it was the right-wing position that ultimately prevailed.
Interesting.
Leading to the formal separation of these labs from the university.
Wow. So it really highlights, the diverse ways in which intellectuals can approach their sense of responsibility.
Yeah, for sure.
Even within the same institutional context.
Absolutely.
Some might prioritize complete disassociation to avoid any perceived complicity,
Right.
while others might believe in the potential for change through continued engagement and internal pressure. And it's interesting, the book also conveys Chomsky's own somewhat understated view of his political activism.
Right.
He often describes it as simply a matter of applying common sense and readily available information rather than some profound intellectual exercise.
Right.
Especially when compared to his more specialized work in linguistics.
Yeah, totally. So finally, as social media and the internet have become such dominant forces in our world,
Right.
how does the book frame the responsibility of intellectuals navigating this relatively new terrain?
Yeah. Has the fundamental nature of that responsibility changed?
Yeah, that's the big question.
Yeah.
Well, Chomsky's core perspective, as presented in these reflections,
Yeah.
is that the fundamental responsibility remains the same.
Okay.
To utilize whatever privileges one possesses to advocate for justice and truth.
Right.
While the internet initially held this promise of a truly open and democratic exchange of ideas,
Yeah.
it has become increasingly shaped by corporate interests,
Right.
raising significant concerns about issues like net neutrality and the widening digital divide.
Right. And he emphasizes that individuals still face this critical ethical choice
Totally.
in how they engage with these powerful platforms.
Yeah.
Will they be used as tools to amplify the voices of the marginalized and challenge existing power structures?
Right.
Or will they inadvertently contribute to the reinforcement of those very structures?
Exactly. So while the medium has undeniably evolved,
Yeah.
the underlying ethical imperatives for intellectuals remain fundamentally consistent with his original arguments.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the responsibility of intellectuals,
Yeah.
several key insights stand out, I think.
Yeah.
Chomsky's initial call to speak truth to power remains incredibly pertinent in our contemporary world.
Absolutely.
The rise of corporate media and the internet have brought about significant shifts
Yeah,
in both the challenges and the tools available to intellectuals.
for sure.
Critical engagement with information, a willingness to question dominant narratives, and this persistent awareness of the potential impact of our actions on the most vulnerable members of society appear as enduring elements of this responsibility.
Totally. And as the reflections and discussions in this book make clear,
Yeah.
fulfilling this responsibility isn't always a straightforward endeavor.
Right.
The complexities surrounding Chomsky's own relationship with MIT and the varied perspectives on contentious issues like the BDS movement underscore these nuances and ongoing debates.
Exactly. And ultimately, this deep dive into these sources leaves us with a vital question for you, our listener. Regardless of whether you consider yourself a traditional intellectual,
Right?
what is your own capacity for intellectual engagement and action within your personal and professional spheres?
That's a great question.
How can you critically evaluate the information you encounter and contribute to a more informed and just society,
Yeah.
drawing upon the insights we've explored today?
I love that.
And we encourage you to delve even further into the full text and the recordings of the conference Q&A.
Yeah, definitely.